Snow went on falling long after the shouting died, a soft and tireless work that blurred the edges of banners and helms and the necessity of breath. The great hall of Winterfell glowed like a kiln in the storm, orange light leaping and retreating on beams blackened by centuries of smoke. The carcass of a boar turned on an iron spit, hissing fat into the flames. Harp strings were mute, drums stilled. The words that had been spoken were still finding places to settle in every listening heart. Jon stood bareheaded on the rushes, the warmth of the fire on one cheek and the cold draft through the shutters on the other, as if the hall itself could not decide whether to claim him. Wolf hair and snow clung to his cloak, and the old leather smelled of horse and iron and the road. All around him the northern lords had faces of carved wood. Manderly's pale and heavy, Glover's rope-tensed, Serwyn's thin as a blade. Lyanna Mormont's small hands were fists in her lap, and her chin was up like the point of a spear. Lord Yon Royce, all rings and duty, watched with the patience of weathered stone. And at the end of the hall, on that high seat of pale heartwood, Sansa sat with her back straight and the shadow of her crown yet to be kindled into reality. He had made the choice quietly, when there were only the white trunks of the godswood to overhear him. He had tested the words against the hush that lived there and found they did not break. The North needed one face to turn to, one voice to trust, one hearth to gather before. Wolves hunted best as a pack but followed one leader. He wanted it to be a Stark who had the North in her bones and the South burned out of her. He wanted it to be someone whose cleverness would not curdle into cruelty, someone who understood both snow and silk and could tell the difference between kindness and weakness. When he had put each name he knew into his heart and waited, hers was the one the wind did not blow away. He had brought the circlet himself. It lay on the table between them on a fold of rough gray wool, a dark iron thing hammered by a Wintertown smith who had been a boy when Robb was crowned and who remembered the look of that day like a wound. It was plain. No jewels, no snarling beast heads, no gilded leaves from a warm land. The metal bore shallow scratches where a hammer had kissed it with purpose. In the light it kept its color like tempered night, and along its ridge 4 low points rose and fell in the memory of the ancient crown of the kings of winter. It was not an object that cried out to be looked at. It was an object meant to be worn without vanishing, to place a weight more on the heart than on the head. He lifted it with both hands and felt the cold it had kept from the yard. He crossed the last of the rushes. When he stood before Sansa, she did not move. The ripple of whispers through the hall sounded like wind in dry reeds. He went to one knee. "Winterfell belongs to the blood that built it," he said. "Not to the hall, but to the place where her breath made a small cloud in the cold. The North is safer with you upon this seat than it would ever be with me. I will serve you with my life and without my name." Her eyes, winter blue and remembering every room she had learned to survive, did not blink. For a long beat, the hall was only fire and snow and the sound of men who were trying not to move. Jon was aware of Ghost in the shadowed arch where the corridor met the hall, a white shape that might have been snow if snow had eyes that glowed like coals. He felt watched by something old that had very little to do with the men whose blood beat and steamed around him. He became very small and very certain. Sansa's mouth parted, as if to deny him or question, or gather up the tangled threads of what had led to this. Her gaze slid past him to the faces of the lords who had once pounded their cups and called another name, a name that began to feel like a shirt that did not fit. She looked back at him, and in her face he saw a dozen things. The child he'd left in a warm corridor with wolves painted on the walls, the girl made to smile for knives, and the woman who had learned the price of power and still reached for it with steady hands. Looking at her, he knew again that he had not been wrong. "Rise," she said softly, and when he did, she took the crown from his hands, and it was as if she took his breath with it. The room leaned closer. He had imagined the way she would speak in that moment, but what she said surprised him, and for that he loved her more. "A queen does not take," Sansa said. "A queen receives." She lifted the iron ring and held it a finger's breadth above her bright hair. "And what she receives she keeps for those who give it." He felt the corners of his mouth pull without meaning to. He took the circlet back from her and set it down once more, and then he lifted it a second time, and this time when he raised it, he did not look at Sansa, but at the hall. "By blood and bone and winter," Jon said, voice low but carrying, "I crown Sansa of House Stark, Lady of Winterfell, Queen of the North." He lowered the iron slowly, as if he feared to startle something delicate into flight, and when it kissed her brow, the old place breathed. It was not thunder that answered, but a murmur gathering a shape, one man's voice, then a woman's, then the small proud shout of a bear cub made human, until it was a single word carried on 100 breaths, each different and sincerely bothered by none of the others. "Queen," they said, rough and beautiful. "Queen in the North." Sansa did not close her eyes. She did not allow the crown to tilt. She did not flinch at the heat or the cold. After, when she rose to speak and thank them, when she answered Lyanna's fierce pledge with a fierceness that had nothing to do with volume, when she promised Wyman the ports would be secure and Robert Glover that the mills would be fed and Lord Royce that Winterfell would not turn its back on the Vale Knights who had bled for it, Jon stood a step behind and to the left, as if he had spent his life in that precise place. He spoke once, to ask that the freezes be watched and that small folk near the tributaries be warned, not for floods only but for strange movements on the banks. He spoke once more to say that wages would be paid for repairs before feasts were thrown. The lords nodded. The hall began to thaw back into sound. When Sansa dismissed them to food and drink and the patterns of rank resumed their dance in the warm smoky air, Jon bent to kiss her on the brow where the iron lay, swift and almost secret, brother to sister, soldier to sovereign. No one dared pretend not to notice. He could feel Littlefinger's gaze from the shadows where he favored watching. He could feel Lord Royce's approval like a leather strap tugged a notch tighter. He could feel something else that was not any man's opinion, an old acceptance, as if the stones were content. Later, when the hall had swallowed the last stirrings of ceremony and hunger had moved men from thinking to eating, he found Sansa in the passage where the cold slid its hand beneath the tapestries undeterred. She had set aside the crown. On her head it left a reddened ring like a memory of pressure. In her hands she held it as if testing its balance, as if wondering whether iron learned the shape of a brow. "Don't you dare vanish from me," she said quietly before he could speak. The breath she let out clouded the air between them. "If you're thinking to slip away into one of your noble exiles, don't. It was hard enough once." He smiled, and the smile hurt. "I'm not noble. I'm necessary." That's the sort of sentence men cut into stones so they can forget the man who said it, Sansa answered, and she leaned against the wall, the wool of her sleeve rasping the carved wolves. "Tell me what you're planning and do it plainly, Jon." He told her in the only place he could, beneath the shelter of the heart tree, where the sap ran slow and red and ancient eyes watched without blinking. Snow whispered through the leaves and the faces in the trunk listened as well as they ever had. Ghost left paw prints that filled with new snow as soon as he lifted his feet. Jon loved this place the way he loved cold water after fire and the way he loved a clean blade, because it woke him and reminded him what mattered. "The North needs its queen seen," he said, "and it needs the man who goes unseen. There are things I can do more easily without a hall full of witnesses. There are men who tell a different truth to a traveler in a fur cloak than they would to a king's steward with a scroll. The free folk will listen to me where they will bristle for any other. Crannogmen can pass where horsemen sink. Dragonglass will be mined only if the right hands dig. Grain can be bought before others think to hoard it. We need 100 small threads pulled taut and none of them visible to the eye that looks for one thick rope." Sansa's gloved fingers had found the grooves of the carved face. She traced the curl of a lip that had never smiled. "You sound like a spy master," she said, and the word lay between them like an old unhappiness. "We had one once. He made a garden of whispers and planted knives among the flowers. The garden grew and grew until it strangled the people who had to walk there." "I know the kind of garden you mean," Jon said. "I'm not planting lilies. I'm stacking wood for winter. We'll bind it with plain twine and say out loud where it sits. No secrets for the sake of sweetness. Only the necessary ones. And when something must be kept unseen, it will be because it protects, not because it could be a lever someday." The corner of her mouth twitched. The godswood took that rare softness and did not give it back to any other eye. "And what will I say when a lord asks me where you have gone? Say that the north has sent its wolf to range," he said. "Say that he comes back with meat and signs and scratches. And if anyone less honest asks, say nothing." "So you mean to go?" Sansa said, and there was no pleading in it, only the clear acceptance of a woman who had been taught by hard teachers that wanting was not the same as getting. "Will you at least leave me men to guard you?" "I'll take Tormund and some of the free folk," Jon said. "You'll keep the North's honor under one roof. I'll keep its shadow spread thin. You have Lord Royce and Maester Wolkan and 100 iron-bellied widows who will say the truth to your face and love you for making them angry. Send Davos to White Harbor when the snows break. Wyman will puff and wheeze and do what must be done." "Davos?" She looked interested despite herself. "Honest as salt," Jon said. "He'll be your tongue where I can't be. If there is a man who can walk into a room without a title and leave it having convinced everyone to do the sensible thing, it's him. But only if you tell him to." She considered that, then nodded once in a way that made him absurdly proud, as if she were wielding a blade and had just decided the cut would be clean. "Very well," Sansa said. "You've a queen, Jon. Now accept that she has you." The snow made a soft roof of the world, and the heart tree's red leaves were small tongues of fire where there were no flames. He saw in her something that was not defiance exactly, but a refusal to be ordinary about love. He took her hand and felt the ice in her glove and the heat beneath it. He had not known, when he was a bastard boy in a warm castle trying not to hate laughter that wasn't his, that he would ever be allowed to be this proud of anything. "Promise me one thing," she said as they left the godswood, her fingers still brushing his knuckles, searching for a warmth that stayed. He waited. "If you are to be a shade that leaves prints," Sansa said. "Don't become a story that I'm not sure was ever true. Don't make me defend a ghost." He thought of Ghost, white as unbroken ground, and of the way the dire wolf left his sign no matter how the weather tried to bury it, and he nodded. "I'll leave you marks," Jon said. "Not so subtle that only clever men can see them." They parted in the covered way at the angle of the keep where the snow drifted deepest because the wind came confused between stone and timber. Sansa returned to the hall to sit with her crown and learn the taste of power that did not humiliate. Jon went to the stables where a shaggy mare rolled her eyes at the storm and 2 free folk stood beside Tormund Giantsbane, who grinned like the wind burning his teeth made him happy. "Would have been a different look if you'd put the iron on your own head," Tormund said, without venom and without dipping his voice for ears that might be listening. "But the she-wolf has more teeth than the men who barked their throats raw for you." "She has enough," Jon said, swinging into the saddle, and Ghost padded to his stirrup as if he had been waiting to be needed. "That's all the North ever asked of anyone." They left through the Hunter's Gate without ceremony. 3 men and a white wolf, though 2 more joined them in the trees and 3 more at the bed of a half-frozen brook. In Wintertown, doors opened and shut as they passed, and once he saw a girl with chapped cheeks lift a lantern and hold it high and squint and smile as if she knew him and knew she should not show it. Smoke lay flat above the thatches. The smell of dung and boiled oats made its own kind of comfort. They climbed into a world that wore distance the way other worlds wore crowns. The woods welcomed them with small, indifferent mercies. Branches bent by snow just enough to allow a rider through, the glitter of ice on a fox's back as it leapt, a silence that was not the silence of halls, but the silence of breath not wasted. Jon let the rhythm of the horse and the rhythm of his own thinking settle into each other. He asked Tormund about the passes that would drift last and the lakes that froze deep enough to carry wagons. He asked the little bird-boned woman who went only by Nella, which Cranagmen had taken to trading their fish for winter cloth, and which had sunk their boats beneath mats of grass to pretend they were no one to anyone. He asked a boy whose eyes looked a little too far apart whether the night had been blue on any particular night, and the boy blinked and said he had seen nothing but a hare that kept changing its mind about where it meant to run. They slept that first night in the leeward hollow of a ruined watchtower that had been a pile of old stones longer than any living man had remembered it being tall. Tormund snored like a bear that had decided against hibernation. The white wolf left and came back with blood on his muzzle, and his breath steamed like a forge. Jon lay beneath his cloak with the kind of tiredness that did not make him slow but sharpened him to a point, and he listened to the snow arranging itself on the silent world. He thought of the hall and the movements of lords around meat, and he thought of Sansa's fingers tracing old sorrow in the bark of a tree, and he thought of the strange honesty of Tormund, who had decided Jon was his friend and had then simply remained that without ever softening his edges to make companionship smoother. He had been king for a breath, and that had been more than enough. Men were too loud when they believed in things that wore a name for them to shout. He listened for the blue stillness that sometimes thrummed too close to the ground in the heart of winter and did not hear it. He slept. Winterfell under Sansa's hand became a place that remembered how to be a house again. Fires were rationed and doors were rehung, and the women who had kept life together while men were gone were given lists, not because the lists taught them anything but because lists thanked them for knowing it. Sansa took Maester Wolkan's advice and then did what she believed was right when the Maester's eyes went the way all Maester's eyes went when food and coin were being counted. She listened to Lord Royce until he had said the same thing 3 different ways, and then she found the thing he had not said and asked him to say that as well. She let Lyanna Mormont speak last during councils so the girl could gather everyone's pride into one hand and show it to them as a wolf pelt turned inside out for tanning. She sent Ser Davos Seaworth south as her hand to the merman's court with a letter sealed in hard red wax, telling him plainly that she had chosen him for the thing he did not think of himself as having. A kind of nobility that didn't need a sigil. He bowed in that odd way of his that made a bow seem honest rather than learned. He brought with him a boy with careful eyes and a wife's token on a cord. Sansa watched them go with the interest she had begun learning to call caution. When she slept, she dreamed of iron sometimes, not the crown but the points of needles, and in the morning she would wake knowing that there were shirts to be mended and cloaks to be cut and soldiers to be warmed with something more than songs. She ate with the soldiers twice a week, and the wise men said that was wise, and the fools thought it was soft, and both kinds did not change her mind. She wrote to houses who had hesitated because they had been burned before, and she did not ask for their loyalty but for their attention. And when they gave the first, she knew she could make something of the second. She had learned in a hard school that promises made in candlelight were not the same as promises kept in snow. Letters came as Jon's shadows. They were not letters at first. She found a strip of bark left where she would look no matter how she promised herself she would not look there, inside the mouth of the iron wolf that watched over the covered way. The bark had 3 short cuts on it, notches that might have meant any number of things if a girl from the kitchens had made them. To Sansa, they meant the ice on the weeping water had gone strange and carried something not dead beneath. Another time a single black feather lay on the arm of her chair, very ordinary and very black in a room made of grays. And the next day the man from the barley farm beyond the ridge came to tell her that 2 of his goats had been taken in a manner that was not the manner of wolves. She did not panic when she heard these small words. Panic made men big and stupid. She allowed herself to become smaller and sharper. Peter Baelish drifted through these days like a wraith that insisted on furs. He tossed his smiles like boys toss pebbles at a river to hear the plop of them. He said useful things and useless things, and in between those he said true things that he wanted her to think were lies and lies he wanted her to think were truths. He would have made the world into a game played upon a board of mute pieces and called that intelligence. Sansa did not banish him, not because she could not, but because to banish him would be to pretend the hunger that had made him was not part of the world as well. She kept him under Lord Royce's eye, and when Peter suggested that she send for more knights from the Vale, she agreed and then put those knights at work hauling stone and timber and standing watch over wells. Peter raised his brows a fraction and smiled the way he smiled when he wanted someone to feel as if a compliment had been paid them. Sansa smiled back and did not feel anything that belonged to him. She brought the Karstarks and the Umbers to the hall one day when the sky was a flat lid and the snow pressed down like a commandment. They came with the stiffness of people who did not think they deserved to be allowed to bend. Sansa had the crown on her head and her hair in a looped braid not for beauty but because the iron caught on loose pins. She told them plainly that the North needed all its limbs and she would not cut off hands that could be set again. She did not forgive them because forgiveness was a kind of food, and she did not feed men who had done what they had done while others were hungry. But she gave them work and oaths and the chance to keep their children's names out of the mouth of the ages when it came to counting shame. The small folk who had been wronged muttered, She asked Wolkan to find the oldest, plainest woman in the winter town who had lost a son to a raid, and she gave that woman the right to count sacks and to strike off the name of any man who came to claim what was not his. The mutters moved from anger to approval very slowly, and then, like ice choosing a path to melt along, they went. When Davos returned, the snow on his beard had done less damage than the politeness of Wyman Manderley's court. He brought casks of grain and a promise of ships when the river mouths let go. He brought 2 shipwrights from Sisterton who were not as good as they believed but better than anyone in the north at saying it. He brought a rumor he had not asked for, that there was talk in King's Landing of a queen made of wildfire and iron and a hand who loved no one but himself, and that the capital had begun to taste like a coin that had been in too many mouths. Sansa took these words and placed them on the table and looked at them with Lord Royce and with Wolkan and with Lyanna Mormont, who stood on a chair so she could reach the bread as easily as the men, and then Sansa put the words away. Jon's shade continued to walk. He wrote to her when there was writing to be done. The letters themselves were nothing and everything. A sprig of yellowed grass wound with a thread, which meant the neck was passable. A sliver of black rock folded into a scrap of old parchment, which meant men had begun to dig where he told them there was glass to be had. Once, a small carving lay upon her bedside, a wolf cut from driftwood with a hole inside it, and within the hole a roll of parchment with words in his hand, the only words he ever asked to be kept from other eyes. There is blue in the woods where there should not be. Not the walker's blue. Not that old, cold blue, not the blue that steals, but a kind of thinking blue that stares and moves away. If I am wrong, I am cautious. If I am right, we will need fires laid where we would not have thought to lay them. She slept with that carving beneath her pillow and woke with the certainty that she would not be warmed by any lie she told herself. She met with the blacksmiths and asked them how much iron could be spared for grates and how many men could be taught in a week to lay a fire that would be nothing, and then, at the hour chosen, everything. Jon walked White Harbor in the clothes of a fisherman whose boat had been iced into patience. He drank beer that tasted of smoke and old wood and listened to men who had nothing to prove because nothing more could be taken from them. He found Wyman Manderley in a chamber that smelled of brine and pastry and listened while the Lord of the Merman's court told long stories that had 3 endings each and turned the conversation so slowly that a man could die of hunger waiting for it to arrive where he knew it was going. Jon did not die of hunger. He was not there to be fed. When the talking was done, the space between 2 words contained a bargain. Ships for grain, silence for readiness. Wyman would put candles in 3 windows of the tower when the river mouths opened, and if 4 candles appeared instead, it would mean the phrase had sent men in the night to spy upon the docks again. Jon left with the taste of leeks and butter and the iron knowledge that Wyman's heart beat far beneath layers of fat and cunning and pride, and that it beat for the north. He went to the Neck with Tormund, and the Crannogmen appeared like reeds learning to move with new wind. One called themselves Frog and another Reed, and none would give names that had been grown for them. They showed Jon how the marshes swallowed a man like a story swallowing a fool, and how to walk on the places where the world remembered how to be firm. They showed him a graveyard of old war left to rot into the water. Spears turned to sponges, shields to rafts of moss. Like an apology no one had come to make. They spoke of Howland Reed in the way men speak of a lake they have learned to love because it keeps their secrets and gives them fish. When Jon spoke of white shadows and blue eyes and the feeling of cold that was not weather, Frog did not laugh. Frog said war came in many temperatures and some of them took longer to learn than others. In the spring that wasn't, a boy vanished from a fishing camp on the shivering forest's fringe, and his sister followed his tracks until they stopped as if a story had turned a page. Jon found the place where the tracks ended and he felt nothing of that terrible stillness he had learned to fear. There were only fox prints, and the fox prints went somewhere. He followed with Ghost until the trail cut a thin line between 2 stands of birch and the wolf went still, his head tilted. The air there felt like something had breathed in and forgotten to breathe out. Jon reached and the hair on his wrist lifted in a wind that did not exist. He did not call out. He took a step back with the quiet of a man leaving a room where a child might be sleeping and waited until the world blinked. Elsewhere, a small thing. A bandit who called himself Lord by virtue of the men too afraid to call him thief. A campfire put out where it needed to be put out. A sack of grain pulled by night to an old widow's door with no name on it because the North had more than enough names already. He learned where to be 3 hours before a thing would happen and where it was best to be 3 hours after. He learned that men who had been refused glory by luck often wanted to die with their names shouted, and he learned the particular wordless gratitude of the ones who never wanted to be noticed at all. He left something behind wherever he went. A scarf repaired with coarse thread by a queen's instructions taken through a line of women like a stone passed hand to hand across a river. A set of poles lashed into a sled so oxen could drag wood where wood would need to be. A new oath sworn in a poorer voice that meant more than any oath sworn in a jeweled one. When he returned to Winterfell for a breath between long breaths, the castle knew him with a gladness that humans could not pretend at. The gate groaned for him like an old friend complaining about getting up. The dogs in the yard went wild and then ashamed. The men who were cleaning the troughs stopped and wiped their hands on their tunics and could not decide whether to grin or salute. In the godswood, the hush that lived there seemed to lean forward. He would have hidden himself if he could, because there was no use in being seen when a man meant to be a shadow, but he could not. Ghost trotted ahead with his tail lifted. He was not a shadow, he was the owner of a shadow. Sansa took him into the solar where the windows looked east and south. The glass had bubbles in it like old air trapped in honey. She looked thinner to him in a way that was not sickness but sharpness. He had never been good at telling a woman she was beautiful without feeling like a boy with a stolen trinket, but he wanted to tell her that she was. It would have been true. "They're calling me hard," she said, with the frankness she had learned to use like a blade when it suited her and like a hand when that was better. "They'll say worse if we starve. Tell me you've found a way to make whispering into bread." "There's glass under rock," he said. "We'll lay it into knives and arrowheads. There's grain sitting in White Harbor like a lord who doesn't want to stand. Manderley will send it up the rivers when he can. Davos says the sistermen will move faster if you swear to hang the first one who steals. I think he's right." She snorted in a very unqueenly way that made him strangely happy. "Hang the first of the men I cannot do without," Sansa said. "Is there a sentence that has ever been less likely to be spoken and more needed?" He watched the snow shifting at the sill. A tiny draft licked his cheek and left. "There's a man near Long Lake who claims to hear a hum when the night is at its thinnest," he said. "Not a song like the ones we know," he says. "A kind of thinking. Have you heard it?" she asked, searching his face for the answer she would rather not hear. "Once," he said, "or something enough like it that I won't call it something else to make it kinder." He set his hands on the table. "It doesn't matter whether we can name it. The North will be ready to burn in rings. I need 5 miles cleared around each village and wood stacked high where you'd never think to put it. I need blacksmiths to teach boys to make points and fletchers to bind shafts like they were binding their own wrists. I need stories to be told, but the right ones. How not to run, how to stand, how to look at something that wants you to look away. That we can do," Sansa said, and her voice made something in him ease that he had not known was tight. "We will do, and you will stop saving us long enough to eat like a human." He ate while she talked of the irritation of men who believed that being asked to work was an insult to their blood. He listened to her speak of Lord Glover's conscience waking with the fury of a man and used to it, of how Wylus Manderley had written in his father's name to conceal the fact that the old lord's gout had him weeping before supper each night, of how Lyanna Mormont had frightened a deserter back into duty not by threatening him but by asking him why he had decided to be a coward. He told her a story about Tormund drinking snowmelt because the water remembered wild horses and tasted braver. She laughed, and the laugh was not pretty exactly. It was homely and good. He slept that night above the kitchens where he could hear the thud of dough being thrown against boards, and he dreamed of ice breaking in a slow, patient way, as if the world had decided to undo itself without hurry. When he woke, Ghost was at the foot of the bed watching the door, and the first light had a color to it that made Jon think of shallow water in deep places. He dressed quietly and went to the Godswood again because there was an emptiness in him that only that place could turn to something else. The snow was falling straight down instead of slanting. His breath smelled of smoke and iron. There was a girl there before him, small in all angles, her hands bare and red and clenched, dark hair braided back in a way that looked ready to come loose if it needed to. She stood so still he almost did not see her until she moved her head like a hunting cat deciding not to spring yet. When she turned, he knew her, and the world did something it did not often do for him. It brought back something he had not managed to lose. "Arya," he said, and she looked at him without smiling, as if smiling would have made the ground unsure. "Ghost gave you away," she said, and then she crossed the snow fast, and the force of her hug was like the way the north held you when you fell, hard and generous and not promising not to break you if you were foolish. He held her and felt the way she had changed, not in size but in gravity. She had become her own weather. "When did you come?" he asked when she had let him go. "Last night," she said. "A cart brought me under sacks of oats and lies. I wanted to be quiet. It's harder to be quiet when you're thinking about how to be quiet." He smiled. "You learned some things." "I learned to pretend to be no one," Arya said. "And then I learned to keep being me inside pretending. I'm still learning to stop killing men who need killing when they aren't my men to kill." She looked past him at the red eyes of the heart tree, as if she were reading an enemy who would be friend enough to answer the right question. "Sansa wears iron on her head, and I do not think it's too heavy for her. That surprised me. It shouldn't have." "It surprises most men," Jon said. "But we don't need most men. We need the right ones." "I'm not a man," she reminded him with a small flash that wasn't a smile either. "I'm a Stark." "That's worse." They stood like that for a time that was both too long and not long enough. He told her that he meant to be a shadow. She lifted her jaw at that, and the wind moved a lock of her hair over her cheek like the touch of something that should not have been there. "You'll be the kind of shadow that makes things look truer," Arya said. "I've seen the other kind. Sansa will need a different shape at her shoulder. I can be that shape." "What shape?" he asked, looking at the short sword at her hip and thinking about the letters that had begun to travel and the carvings he left where they would be found. "The one men notice only after they've said the words they meant to keep," Arya said calmly. "I can stand at Peter's elbow and blink. He'll start trying to impress me. He won't be able to stop himself from thinking he's found an apprentice. Men like him don't know how to keep their lessons to themselves. They're proud of them. They love their own tricks like children." She lifted a shoulder. "I can be stupid in front of him. I won't enjoy it, but I can do it." Jon thought of Peter Baelish and felt the old anger that had no fear in it, only a deep weariness with the game men played with people who were not game pieces. "Don't be too stupid," he said, and Arya gave him a look that made him remember the first time she had hit a target with a stick and not apologized. "I'll be exactly as stupid as I need to be," she said, "and no more." Then, after a moment in which the heart tree seemed to sigh, she added, "You'll tell me if the blue you feel is the old kind." He nodded. "You feel it too?" "Sometimes," Arya said. "In my teeth. In the places where a room forgets it has corners." He swallowed the bitter taste that rose with that. "We'll lay fires where rooms forget. Sansa says she'll learn to hang thieves and still sleep at night." Arya's eyes softened in a way that almost hurt him to look at. "I was cruel once," she said. "I wore it like a cloak to stop the wind, kept me alive. Sansa knows the difference between a cloak and a skin now." She hooked her arm through his for a heartbeat. "Don't stay gone too long. If you want to be a ghost, remember that ghosts belong to houses too." He left Winterfell again at midday with a pack heavier than the last time and a sense of being followed by goodwill and knives. The sky had light in it like a promise no one had yet made. Ghost moved ahead through the flurries, parting them. Jon could not decide whether the snow was thinner or he had grown thicker to resist it. He decided it didn't matter. There were ridge paths he had not walked, men he had not warned, caches he had not laid and would need to lay where no hand that mattered would trip over them. He did not look back until the first line of trees hid the towers, and when he did, he saw the smoke of Winterfell rising honest and gray into the cold. Steadied him. Nights grew stranger without becoming worse. He walked into a hamlet where an old man sat with his feet in a basin of warm water, and a woman wept because her husband had no more fingers and the winter had taken those because he had tried to save a pig. He walked into a cave where men had gathered to say words in a language older than oaths. He walked past a field where a horse stood as if it had been carved there, and when he went close, he saw that frost had made lace around its eyes, and it watched him with a patience he did not want to earn. He set a fire at the edge of the field and waited until the lace melted. Once, on a night when the wind was a knife that had decided to be kind enough to cut cleanly, he felt the thought again, the blue at the hinge of the world where the world opens and shuts. Ghost went still, and so did John, and for a time longer than the length of a breath and shorter than the length of a song, there seemed to be an ear pressed to the skin of the forest, listening for a heartbeat that was not the forest's. Then the pressure passed, as if the ear had decided to go listen elsewhere. John built a small fire and kept it small and fed it with branches that popped and whined. He did not sleep. In the morning he left prints where Sansa would have been glad to know there were prints, and he covered others where she would not. On the day they found the first vein of dragonglass in an outcrop that looked like a broken tooth, Tormund hit the rock with a grin that made a child out of his huge, dangerous face. The glass came in hunks like night that could be thrown. John held one and could feel heat that wasn't warmth in it. It was the heat of something old remembering its name. He closed his fist and felt the edges bite. He imagined those edges biting into the blue that thought, and he no longer felt helpless. He imagined the knives in the hands of fishermen and the arrowheads in the quivers of boys whose mothers had never thought their hands would pull a string for anything but a hair. He thought of Sansa approving the allocation of leather and men cursing and then learning and then bringing their curses to the fire to laugh at them. He thought of Arya standing in an archway listening to Peter teach her how to betray the world without knowing he was teaching her how to be patient. He took a shard of glass and a strip of leather from his belt and bound them into a small thing that would cut if it needed to. He left it under a stone by the door of a house where a woman with a baby had begun to sing at night so the baby wouldn't hear the wind. The woman would not know who had left it, and that was fine. The North had learned in the long winters to love gifts that came without names. Ravens came and went with honest clatter. Sansa wrote to the mountain clans in words that would not offend if read aloud and would ask pride to help rather than beg it. She wrote to Lord Serwyn in a hand that looked more like her mother's every day. She wrote to men whose courage had slept and asked them to wake it without humiliating them for having it at all. When she needed to, she wrote lies that were not the kind that kill. She began to sleep in the afternoon once a week because a mind is a horse and a horse needs to be walked before ridden. She went to the battlements and breathed until her breath did not look like fear. The crown grew less strange on her head. The first of the fires was laid in the shadows of a village that had never seen a king and would have been suspicious of one if it had. Sansa herself rode out under a sky so clear it made the cold ache like grief. Lord Royce did not approve and approved anyway. She let the people see her without armor and without soft leather and without velvet. She wore wool and her gloves were mended because the mending would be seen and would teach the right lesson if anyone was watching for lessons to learn. She asked the boy who had learned to fletch to show her the arrowhead he'd bound, and she nodded as if it were a jewel. She did not make a speech because speeches wear out the ears of those who need to hear other things. She thanked the women who had stacked the wood because no one ever believed to thank them for that, and she wanted to thank them twice. When she mounted again, a girl with a runny nose and eyes too big for her face called out, "Your Grace." It came thin and brilliant across the air, and Sansa looked down to answer, and the girl said, "Tell the wolf to come back soon." And the woman who might have been the girl's mother cuffed her gently, and Sansa pretended not to see the cuff and said, clearly, so that men would hear the words as well as women and boys as well as girls, "He will come when he's needed and not a step sooner, and if you see a print in the snow that you're sure wasn't there before, know that he's already been." The girl's big eyes grew huge. Lord Royce breathed out in a cloud, a little amused against his will. By then, the blue in the woods had begun to move more often where no one wanted it. Not yet the old terror walking, no cracking of warmth like glass beneath its feet, no sound of all sounds being sucked backwards into a throat that was not a throat, but a thinking presence that had discovered curiosity. John felt it on several nights, at several distances, as if he were being triangulated by something that had not learned numbers but had learned hunger. He did not always light a fire when he felt it. Sometimes he sat in the dark with his hand on Ghost's shoulder and his breath slow, and he let the blue look. He had the sense that it was not looking for him in particular so much as for the trace of something that he carried, like a scent on a man's clothes from a fire he had sat beside the night before. When it moved away, it left the world relieved and oddly ashamed. There were other enemies. There were always men hiding inside hardships. A petty lordling from the hills decided that a convoy of grain bound for Serwyn could be improved by his guests eating all of it while his hosts went hungry. Jon did not kill him. He took him by the collar before his own men and said slowly, so more than one kind of man could understand, "I can kill you and make a story of it that will keep fools from trying what you tried, or I can leave you alive to work the debt you've made until your grandchildren curse you and your bones ache in the night and you have to learn to live with it." The man tried to look brave and failed. He chose the debt without seeing that it had been chosen for him already. Jon told Sansa, and Sansa sent a woman from the winter town with a book and a piece of charcoal, and she denied the man's family sugar and beer until she pronounced them paid, and that would not be for a very long time. In the castle, Peter taught Arya how to cheat at cards. He did not say he was teaching her that, but that is what the lesson was. He showed her how to watch hands rather than eyes, because eyes lied and hands confessed. He asked her questions about where she had gone, and she lied in a way that made him want to catch her and did not allow him to. He allowed himself to be charmed by her bluntness because he thought he understood how it protected something soft. He told stories with two truths and an untruth each, and Arya decided which was which and stored them the way a hunter stores snares. She came to Sansa at night sometimes and went over the words they had heard that day until they could no longer make themselves believe a dangerous thing was safe. They did not always agree. They always agreed to disagree where no other ears could take their disagreements and use them to mean something that was not intended. Winter ripened, as it does, into the kind of time that strips words of fat and gives them only the muscle they need to move. People grew mean and then grew ashamed of having been mean and then put the shame away and did not look at it. Fires burned where they were supposed to. Fires waited where they had been laid to wait. Boys learned not to stare at blue sky as if it meant spring, because the blue could mean other things. The dragonglass came up slowly, and the first of the blades went out into the hands of men who had never held anything their lord had not told them to hold first. They made their own rituals without being told. Touching the point to the lintel, lifting the blade to the breath like a priest lifts a wafer, setting it next to the bed where the child slept and feeling, for the first time in a long time, that sleeping might be something you could choose rather than something that came upon you like weakness. Jon was in the high country when he found the tree with the markings carved too cleanly to be the work of a child. A man might have thought hunters had laid sign for one another, the way some men do when they want to pretend they are creatures with instincts more interesting than hunger and thirst. Jon knew the sign of the free folk and the sign of the mountain clans and the sign of old soldiers who taught themselves to whisper and pretend night made them clever. This was none of those. It was too patient. It was too neat, and yet it did not care whether anyone saw it. It was the neatness of stone. He set his fingers against the cut, and the cold of it ran through his hand like a river. Ghost growled low and long, and Jon looked up at the sky and saw that the blue there was the same as the blue he had felt beneath the skin of nights to the south. He took his hand away. He did not touch his knife. There was no use in touching iron for this. He took a small bundle from his pack and laid it on the snow beneath the cut. A tinderbox and a twist of cloth soaked in oil and a knife of black glass. He left those things as if he were leaving bread on a grave. He did not know what manner of eyes would find them. He knew only that the north had begun to come to him in strange ways, and he had to meet it where it asked to be met. When he returned to Winterfell again to tell Sansa what he had seen, the snow was coming down in flakes as large as coins. He shook himself like a dog at the gate, and Ghost shook as well, and the guards cried out because the cold that flew from them bit. The hall was quieter now at nights with the food saved for morning, but there was still enough warmth and noise to make a man remember he lived among other living things. Sansa sat at a smaller table with Arya and with Lord Royce and with Davos, whose knuckles were red as berries. She looked up when Jon came in, and he could tell from her face before he spoke that she had learned something she had not planned upon learning. "What is it?" he asked, even as he was taking great pleasure in the hot wine pressed into his hand by a woman who had decided he would drink it and he would like it. Sansa smiled without humor and tapped the table with one finger. a habit she'd taken up that made men think of a queen and made Arya think of a sister telling a story to her dolls. "Word from the south," she said. "A raven broke its beak getting here. Our work will not be simple, Jon." "It never was," he said, and shook the last of the cold from his hair. She nodded.
"No."
"But now the game has expanded its board." She lifted the parchment. "The south thinks to look north again. We will make sure it sees what we want it to see." He sat beside his queen and across from his sister and felt, with a relief as frightening as it was sweet, that he was where he was supposed to be for the length of a single night. He told them of the marks on the tree and the particular ordinary horror of neatness in a wild place. He told them that the blue had grown thoughtful. Sansa listened and did not say the thing he knew she was thinking, that thinking enemies were worse than unthinking ones. Arya listened and said, "We will put thinking fire in their path." And Davos listened and said, "We will need men who can stand still without thinking themselves brave for doing it." "What do we say to the south?" Lord Royce asked, and he made the word south sound like an illness one survived by stubbornness. Sansa smiled again, and this time the smile had warmth in it. She took her crown off and set it on the table and rubbed the reddened ring on her brow with the heel of her hand as if it were a bruise. "We say that the north is quiet," she said. "We say that we are repairing roofs and counting sheep. We say that we are grateful for our small lives." She lifted her eyes to Jon's. "And we lay our fires in rings." Jon felt the truth of that settle in his bones. He knew then, with the quiet certainty that comes when a man stops trying to make the world be what he wishes and begins to see what it is, that the shadow he intended to be would not be the shadow of a single man. It would be the collective shade of a forest planted by many hands that blocked the view of enemies and sheltered children and made its own weather. He thought of the simple iron of the crown and the complicated iron of winter and the black glass of knives. He thought of Sansa's promise and his. He drank the hot wine and warmed his hands over the fire and let himself be happy in that small human way that does not need permission from any throne. Outside, the snow continued its work, purposeful and slow, changing the shapes of familiar things until they revealed their deeper outlines. In the yard, a boy practiced drawing a bow, standing with his feet stubbornly wrong until a woman who had been a girl with a runny nose yesterday came and moved them gently and made him right. In the Godswood, the tree kept its watch and made its soundless prayers to powers that were not interested in being thanked. On a ridge above Long Lake, the blue hung for a moment like a memory and then withdrew, as if it, too, had decided to wait. And in the heart of Winterfell, where the light was kind to old stone and the smoke was kind to cold men, a queen and her wolf brother leaned over a map that was less a picture of roads and rivers than a chart of the ways people might move, might fear, might hope. They spoke low and left their marks in the right places. They planned fires that would never be seen until they were needed. They planned kindnesses that would be remembered when nothing else could be. They did not speak of crowns any more that night, because crowns are only iron without hands to hold them and heads to bear them. They spoke of bread and of glass that cut the right things, and of old stories that would be told in new ways around hearths where people could sleep. They spoke until the candles guttered and the hall was brave and tender around them, and then they slept like people who mean to earn morning. The raven that had broken its beak came with 2 seals and a smear of wax like blood. Sansa warmed it in her hands until the wax yielded, and the parchment uncurled the way a fist uncurled in sleep. The words were court words, their edges softened by thickness of ink, their intent hidden behind a procession of titles. Somewhere in the south, a woman had made a chair out of her enemies and set herself upon it. Somewhere else, a different woman had built a fleet out of her anointing and come east with dragons. The letter did not say any of that in plain, but it said that the south had remembered to look north and expected to see the north looking back. Sansa wrote an answer that had the kindliness of stone. She thanked the sender for their concern and the snow that sent health to the cheeks of the North's children and the wolves that kept the flocks honest. She said they would send wool when they could and prayers when they must, and that the roads were unkind to ambitions just now. She signed her name with the steadiness of someone who understood that a name was a bridge others had to cross before they could come to her. Arya sat at the corner of the table while she wrote, flipping a small knife between her fingers until the motion became a clock no one could hear. Lord Royce arranged his rings so that they glinted in the candlelight and did not argue. Davos made small sounds of approval when the sentences that did not quite submit but did not quite refuse found their shapes. The snow outside the window breathed without hurrying, and the castle took that into its old bones. Jon left again before dawn, his breath white and clean, his horse throwing up little scuds of ice that caught the lantern light as he passed the last gate. Tormund fell in beside him with the relief of a man who does not enjoy roofs. 3 free folk who called themselves Leaf, Broke, and Mouse joined as they crossed the first stream, the names falling in behind him as easy as footprints. Ghost moved ahead like a prayer that did not mind being answered by work. They were aiming for the low country where the ground remembered old ridges beneath new snow, a place of half-buried stones where a rider could look like a tree if he needed to. This was where the fires would matter most. Not near the great halls and the boasts of men, but where lives were measured in sled loads and the wise could teach the stubborn to stand their ground. Jon had told Sansa what he meant to do. He had kissed the crown she wore with a brother's care and said nothing to it. She had told him to make prints he would not mind her following. The first village they came to had made its ring the way a child would draw it with a stick, with places too thin and places too thick. Jon watched men feed wood into the thin places until the ring was more honest. He watched women set out baskets of tinder wrapped in oilcloth. He watched a boy with a face that might have been carved out of a not learned to strike flint to steel until the spark came, and he told him to keep the steel in a dry pocket and the flint in a different pocket, and why. He carved a small 3-armed mark into the lintel of the meeting house with his knife, then set the splinter of wood down on the sill to blow away at its own pace, and the men watched in that way men do when they think they're pretending not to. An old woman with a back bent like a bow came to him after, her hands blunt and red, her eyes undeceived. "Others passed through here," she said, "years ago, not like you, with wolves and a way of making men laugh without losing their teeth. Small ones, quiet ones. They had reeds in their hair and moved as if the ground liked them. They showed us where a path looked safe and wasn't. They said they had a lord who liked to keep water between him and his enemies. Do you know him?" Jon thought of the neck as a creature that had learned to lie still. He thought of a man his father had called friend. "I don't know him," he said carefully, "the way a man knows the smell of his own cloak, but I know someone who could bring him to me if I asked with enough patience." "Ask him," she said, as if she were telling him to eat with his mouth closed. "The water knows things the hills forget." They moved on through wind that had a taste of iron. The lakes were stone cold and told the sky nothing. The night came early and brought blue with it, not the old blue that ate warmth, but the aware blue that paused outside the ring of their fire as if it had never seen flame before and was deciding whether it hated it. Ghost lifted his head and narrowed his eyes and did not growl. Jon kept his own eyes half-lidded so the fire wouldn't blind him, and meanwhile he forced himself to notice useful things. The split in Tormund's boot that would need wax, the way Leaf leaned when she was tired, holding her shoulders like a woman who had learned to survive the weight of a pack and the weight of watching both. At dawn the blue was gone, the sky honest again in its cold, and a fox had written its short poem in the snow near their coals. They scattered the ashes and moved on. They came to a stand of birch so white the world seemed to be speaking in one voice. There, where the bark peeled like healing skin, Jon found the neat cut upon the trunk, just high enough that a tall man would have to reach for it, just deep enough to be deliberate without wanting to show off. It was the same cut he had found before, the same unruffled patience. He put his palm to it and felt that strangeness run through his hand again, the sensation of something listening without ears. He had brought the tinderbox and the oilcloth and the glass with him since the first time. He set the gift beneath the cut and stepped back. Ghost's breath rose in 2 brief plumes and then settled, as if the direwolf had decided to mimic the winter rather than fight it. They waited. They had learned to wait. The hours made their round like men on a wall. In the afternoon, when the light had begun to thin, reeds rustled in a place where there were no reeds. Tormund's hand went to his axe shoulder without making the last move. 3 men arrived with the quiet of people who had practiced not being noticed until it had become their manner and not their trick. They had faces like water waiting for a stone to fall. The smallest of them stepped forward and smiled in a way that was not a smile. "You left bread under a tree," he said. "It is rude not to see who eats it." Jon looked at him and felt the odd lift in his chest that comes when a thing you have hoped for is also a thing you are not altogether ready to receive. "I was told the water remembers," he said. "It does," the man said. "It remembers what was dropped in it. It remembers who decided to drown and who decided not to. It remembers oaths made in a tower when men were young and a woman was dying." He put out his hand, bare and narrow. "Howland Reed." The name came like a stone breaking the surface, and the circles it made moved outward into old stories. Jon took the offered hand without the ceremony he felt it deserved. It was warm as if it had been in a pocket. "I'm Jon," he said, and left the rest of his names where the Reeds could hear them without his needing to speak them. Reed's eyes looked at him like a man measuring a river for his daughter to cross. He let Jon go. "The marks you found," he said, laying a palm on the cut in the birch, "are not mine. I don't like tidy things that much, but I feel them as you do. The blue that thinks is not the blue that kills. It is scouting. Curiosity ordinarily keeps children alive. In this case, we will have to teach it a lesson." "Teach it," Tormund repeated, delighted. "You talk like a man who thinks talking is good for knives." The Crannogman looked at him without dislike. "A knife that doesn't know how to listen will not cut where it needs to," he said. "Come, and I'll show you where the ground has been taught to do what men can't." They followed him through reeds that revealed themselves only as they chose. The neck had its own cold, a damp that soaked through leather and then remembered it had nowhere to go. Jon moved one foot in front of the other the way he had been taught to when a fall meant more than a bruise. There were places where the water seemed to stand up to look at them. There were places where the sky lay down at the same level as the earth and the world lost its edges. They came at last to a hummock like the humps of old cattle lying down, and there, arranged as if a child had placed them and then a mother had come behind and corrected them, were stones set in a ring with a hollow in the center packed with earth and char. Reed crouched and brushed a smear of moss away from one of the stones to show a carved mark, not neat at all, but repeated over and over until the stone had learned to bear it. 3 lines crossing and crossing again, the simplest knot. "Fire holds best in a memory," he said. "We set it in a place where it has already been and will agree to return. If you lay your rings where the ground has no habit, they will work and then be forgotten. Lay them here, or where here has been, and the blue that thinks will learn to go around rather than through." "Wardings?" Leaf said softly, and her voice held unease that was not fear so much as respect. "Your people talk to the old as if it were still listening." "It always listens," Reed said. "It does not always care, but it cares more than you might like when someone comes along who thinks everything can be learned with a hammer." He straightened with a small sound a man makes when his bones remember they are not reeds. "You'll need 9 of these within a morning's walk of Winterfell, and more as far as your hands can reach. You will also need to make the idiots who think they are brave stand inside the rings instead of outside them where they can feel proud." Tormund laughed. "You speak the truth as if it were soup. Hot and simple." "I don't mind soup," Reed said. "It warms nothing but the belly and has killed fewer men than pride." Jon watched the wind move across the surface of a pool where no wind should have been. He felt again the pressure of blue, far away and not. "Will this stop the old kind?" "No," Reed said, and his mouth made a line like a drawn bow. "Nothing stops that but breaking it. But it will confuse it for a moment and steal it a step. Sometimes a step is all you're owed." He cocked his head at Jon. "Sometimes a step is all you're owed and you make it count." They spoke until the light gave out of the day. Reed taught him how to cut the 3-armed knot into lintels and stones and doors, and how not to do it where men would see it and decide to pry. He taught him how to choose wood that remembered lightning. He taught him how to lay a fire with green branches on top so a fool would think it would never catch, and then to pull the green aside at the last so it would. He did not ask for fealty. He did not give it. When they parted, He put his narrow hand on John's shoulder and left it there longer than courtesy required. "You were owed a truth a long time ago," he said. "Truths owed ripen badly, but they can be eaten if you're hungry enough. Not today. Not when the world is listening." He let go. "Tell your sister the water is with her. It likes her because she does not try to tell it what to do." John went back north with damp in his bones and a set of lessons that did not care whether he slept or not. He laid rings where rings would remember. He carved the knot where it needed to be carved and then spat into the cut, not because spittle has power, but because a man should leave some of himself in the places he asks to keep him safe. Ghost worked in silence, his paws carving their own wards into drifts. In Winterfell, Sansa's weekly weighings had become a custom strong enough to irritate people who did not like custom that had been invented without their permission. On seventh days she sat with a ledger and a slate and a woman from Wintertown whose eyes did not miss, and they listened to grievances. She listened to a man who had sold old oats as new, and a man who had beaten a boy because the boy had looked at his daughter, and a woman who had stolen salt fish because she had a child who would not stop coughing. She did not judge with her temper. She judged with the memory of her own helplessness, which is the right way to stop being helpless. She fined, she shamed, she forgave, she promised, and always she kept count. Peter watched these proceedings with polite interest, as if he were waiting for a particularly clever move in a game he enjoyed more than eating. He had come to Arya with a thin smile and a deck of cards printed with painted ladies and kings with knives hidden in their scepters. They played in an antechamber after supper on nights when men pretended they were not tired. He taught her games in which the order mattered more than the numbers and games in which the numbers lied. He asked her questions meant to braid her into his rope, little things about where she learned to hold a knife that way and big things about what she had thought when the heads on the walls had started to stink. She answered in short, blunt pieces that made him want to pull for more. He showed her how to watch the corners of a mouth rather than the eyes. She let him win 3 times in a row and then beat him so neatly he praised himself for having taught her. Men like him liked the shape of another person's hunger. Arya made a hunger for him to see, for his cleverness, for his regard. She fed it like bread to a bird and watched it make him bold. One night, when the cards were out and Peter's hands were moving like a prayer, she allowed herself to make a little mistake with a tale about a lantern at the Hunter's Gate that had been left burning too long and made a shadow in the wrong place. She watched, and there it was. His pupils widened and then did not. He stored the information not because it mattered but because he might make it matter later. It was an old trick, a hand keeping a kernel for a winter that might never come. Now she knew which hand held it. After that, she followed him sometimes. She did not use a face that wasn't hers. She used the face that had learned to be no one and then someone again. She became a corner, a shape in a shadow, a girl holding a pail. She watched him whisper to a scribe from the Vale who liked to be afraid. She watched him gift a bag of flour to a woman whose husband was away and say something that made the woman look at him like a road that was both safe and dangerous. She watched him test Sansa's edges with compliments that had apologies hidden inside them, and then fold his hands as if he had never spoken when Sansa did not blush. She learned his routes and his easy prey. She learned where his small stash was because men like him always had a small stash. Letters tied with ribbon, a little gold that came and went like a fox, a token he believed would buy him a day when the world went wrong. She took one letter and replaced it with a look-alike she had written with a hand borrowed from Wolken after she told him she wanted to practice. The words said something a little truer than the original had said and were designed to be found by a man who was not meant to find them. Later, Lord Royce went very still in a corridor and told Peter something in a low voice that made the other man's mouth go thin and sharp. Peter smiled after and arranged his face like a room made ready for guests. He was careful for 3 days. Then he went back to being himself. Winter grew a little teeth and then more. The river mouths let go and ships came into White Harbor like blunt-nosed fish who had decided to be eaten by a bigger fish for the pleasure of it. Wyman Manderley's candles sent their messages with faithful tedium. Davos wrote back with the patience of a man who had learned to make honesty feel like a bargain. Furs went south for salt and rye, and smiths came north from Sisterton for pay that would not astonish a lord but would keep a man in boots and bread. They taught the Karstarks to build iron baskets for beacon fires, and the Karstarks taught them how to lash a beam so one man could lift what had taken two. People learned new things and pretended they had always known them. On a night when the wind had tired itself out and decided to become a weight instead of a knife, an envoy came up the King's Road under a flag that had once made the North angry and now made it tired. The envoy was tall and thin in a way that made his clothes look like they had forgotten him. He had the careful voice of a man who had learned to make orders sound like advice. He told Sansa that the queen in the south, a queen whose name he spoke as if it were a title for sorrow, expected fealty and tax, and if the North could not afford both, it should at least afford courtesy. He smiled when he said the last, and his teeth showed too much. Sansa listened and let the silence make him adjust his gloves. Then she said she was grateful for the queen's concern for roofs and flocks, and that the North knew how to be courteous to winter and could extend the same courtesies to anyone who came with more concern than greed. She said that commodities traveled better than oaths through snow, and that when the passes were clear she would send wool and iron and a skin of something truly northern if the South wanted to know how courage tasted. She smiled and did not show her teeth. The envoy swallowed without meaning to. Davos took him aside after and told him the road back would be kinder if the man took bread in his saddlebag rather than pride. Jon heard of the envoy when a boy brought a message to the cairn he had asked to be built at the fork of two deer paths. He was far north, where the pines made the air smell like old bells and the snow read like script if you had learned the letters. He read Sansa's small report and the little flourish Arya had put at the end of it to let him know that Peter had flinched, and he warmed himself not at a fire but at the knowledge that his sister and his queen were learning to be two people in one. They had made 5 rings near Winterfell and were laying the 6th when the blue came closer than it had come before. The pressure did not push, it caressed. Ghost lifted his lip. Leaf laid her hand on the nearest stone and spoke to it under her breath. Not because she believed stones could hear the way men hear, but because she knew stones understood being spoken to at all. Tormund rose to his full height like a man about to carry something heavy. The cold shifted. For a long moment nothing happened. Then the blue moved on without entering. Felt insulted, the way a cat feels when a door is shut in its face. Jon did not lower his hand until the feeling had become the usual cold again. What did it learn? Mouse asked, breath sawed thin in his throat. That we are not as stupid as we look, Tormund said, and grinned as if he had eaten something that had fought him and lost. Not much of a lesson, Leaf muttered, but better than teaching it where our bellies are thin. They went on. In a farmyard half buried in snow, a girl's laugh cut the wind and made Jon look over a wall. He saw the girl guiding a sledge loaded with wood, and behind her a boy nodding like a tired ox, and beyond them their mother, not much older than the girl, rubbing her hands together to make heat. He could not give them spring. He could make the ring behind their barn better. He could make sure the dragonglass knife he left in the eaves did not fall to the mud. He could stand with them for a moment longer than he had meant to and let them see that the wolf was not just a story for nights when sleep was shy. The first real test came in a place that had been kinder in summers. A hunter who had not learned to say no to the woods on a day when the woods meant to say no to him went out under a mild sky and did not come back. His wife came to the ring of the village and waited, as if a man could walk out of smoke. The boys with fletched arrows shifted their feet, their mouths dry. In the middle of the second night, a shape moved at the edge of sight, a shape with the wrong joints and the wrong silence. The ring burned low with banked coals like eyes waiting under lids. The shape moved closer and stopped when the fire was nothing. It was the wrong kind of blue but thinner, as if it had come to see whether the old cold remembered names here. Jon arrived before dawn with Ghost and with 3 men who had learned to stand and not break their eyes. He took the green branches off the low fire in a single lift, and the flame went up fast as breath drawn by a frightened child. The shape hesitated. That was all they were owed, a hesitation. Jon moved on it with the knife of glass and the spearhead he'd bound that morning, and the first strike cut in without resistance, and the second had the feel of killing a thing that had been a man and had decided not to be and had been wrong. The body collapsed like a set of opinions being abandoned. The villagers made a sound that did not have a name. Jon stepped back into the ring and let them see him breathe. Fire first, he said simply. Fire first and then you cut. And if you don't cut, the fire will. But if you think you can cut without the fire, you will learn a lesson you do not want to learn. A boy with a mouth too large for his face asked, Can the fire burn all the way back to where the blue comes from? If enough of us lay it the right way, maybe. John said, not because he believed the boy needed hope, but because he believed the boy needed the right shape of work. If not, it will burn a path for us to walk. And there are men who will be standing on the other side, where we cannot see them yet. The boy looked at the knife in his hand as if it had become a friend and a burden. John left that village with ash in his hair and the smell of meat in his clothes and the knowledge that the blue had learned something it did not enjoy learning. He scratched a mark into a birch where someone would find it and know the ring had been tested and held. He sent a raven because sometimes old honesty is faster than new cleverness. Back at Winterfell, Sansa had devised a way to hide iron baskets in plain sight. She called them grain towers and set them in a pattern that would make sense to a woman counting bushels and also to a man with a coal in his hand and a steady mind. The smiths made the baskets and the carpenters made the frames and the boys made themselves useful carrying and learning how to climb without falling. It turned a thing that might have been only frightening into a community's work. People love to keep busy when fear sits like a cat at the corner of the room. The problem is always finding the right busy. She did not forget beauty. She told the women who had always embroidered for their daughters' dowries to bind winter flowers onto the banners she hung over the basket frames so a stranger might think them decorative. Sansa chose red thread ordinary enough to be without vanity and bright enough to be seen from a wall. The banners were soft against iron, and when the wind took them they looked like tongues that could speak if they wished. Lyanna Mormont came to a weighing with blood on her knuckles that she had not bothered to hide. She told Sansa the men of Bear Island had laughed at the idea of practice fires until the third ring went up and the smoke had made them think of home and battle at the same time. She said they would stand where they needed to stand and eat where they needed to eat, and had Sansa considered putting shovel heads near the rings because men forget the simple things when they are afraid. Shovels, Sansa repeated. Because a man with a shovel believes he is working and then becomes brave by accident. Lyanna nodded solemnly, as if this had been her thought. Also because if the fire goes where it isn't wanted, you would rather be the person with a shovel than the person wishing you had one. Done, Sansa said. Consider it done, Lady Mormont. Peter offered to assist in the distribution of shovels, a phrase that made the sentence sound like a jest. Sansa looked at him as if he had offered to carry her cloak across the hearth. Lord Royce will see to it, she said mildly. I would not want you to be cold. Arya kept a ledger of the ledgers she knew Peter had touched, which is to say she kept one small book and in it each line had 3 lines hidden beneath. Once, she left the book face up on a table where Peter would pass. He did not touch it. He laughed at it in a voice that held no laughter. Later, she moved it to a place he would not pass and he arranged to pass there anyway and still did not touch it. Men like him needed to know they could touch a thing if they chose, and they needed to prove their virtue by not touching it until they were alone. When he finally touched it, it left a smear of dark on the pad of his finger. He wiped his hand on his cloak, annoyed and pleased and uncertain which more. Arya watched and learned something she would use later. Word came that the Umbers had rebuilt a causeway, and that the Karstarks had lent men to lift stones because stones do not ask whether the hand that lifts them has been faithful. Sansa invited the heads of both houses to Winterfell not for a counting of apologies but for a counting of roofs. They spoke little and ate well and were sent away with lists in Wolken's neat hand that said how many men they must send where and by what day. They left with relief disguised as obedience. In the hall, Davos murmured, "Sometimes a list is kinder than forgiveness," and Sansa looked grateful in the way that makes a man straighten his back because he feels someone else's pride wearing his name. On a night the cold had a taste of steel left in a snowdrift, Jon came back to the castle with a smear of ash on his jaw and a piece of news he did not wish to bring. 2 boys taken by something that had moved at the edge of a ring and retreated and then come back when a man had wandered where the fire didn't remember him. He said it quickly because some pains grow larger in the mouth. Sansa took the news into her hands without dropping it. She called for Wolken and a map and asked him to make circles small enough that boys would not have to travel beyond them to find their sheep. She sent Arya to the kitchens to tell them to give more bread to the places where grief would be sitting at tables. She told Lord Royce to send a rider to Bear Island with thanks for the thought of shovels and a request for more. "Has the Blue learned that we teach?" she asked when the map had been marked and the names had been set. "It has learned we are not alone," Jon said. "It will try to take someone who is alone next." He rubbed a thumb over the knuckles of his right hand where the cold had cracked the skin and the blood had dried into a map of small rivers. "We will stop being alone, as much as we can." Sansa nodded. "We will make it unfashionable." They slept little. They worked much. Sometimes the castle felt like a body that had learned to breathe differently. It did not breathe with fear, though fear tried. It breathed with watchfulness. On the 5th day after Jon returned, an accident that was not entirely an accident occurred in the barrel house near the south wall. A cask of oil burst like a bad opinion. A lantern tripped, and a flame climbed the wall like a thief. Men came with buckets and women with wet cloaks and boys with panic, and the fire was out before it had found the wood that would have made it joyful. Sansa looked over the blackened stone and thought it too convenient. She arranged for the barrels to be moved on a different schedule. She told Arya to use her ears like a dog's. She told Lord Royce nothing, and he saluted her with his mouth set in a line like a drawn bow. That night Arya followed Peter not to the barrel house, because he was no fool, but to the stables. He stood for a time with his breath a white ribbon and looked at the horse that was his, and then at a horse that was not his, and then at a child who curried a third and looked down when he tried to meet her eye. He put a hand to a saddle and traced the stitching. He looked at a door. Arya stood behind the door and listened to him not opening it. It is a useful thing, learning what a man will not do. It teaches you what he will do next. In the months that were not months so much as a series of days that did not know how to speak to one another, Jon came and went and his prints were found and the marks he left were read. He became a rumor that had hands. Ghost became a streak in the corner of a woman's eye and then a relief. The Crannogmen appeared where they were needed and taught the mountain clans how to walk in marsh, and the mountain clans taught the Crannogmen how to turn a rock into a friend when a field would not be won. The rings multiplied and the fires behaved themselves until they were called to be rude. Spring pretended from time to time, as spring does, and then went away like a lover with other obligations. On such a day of pretense, Sansa went down into the winter town with 2 guards and a cloak without richness and walked the lanes. The air smelled of soap and smoke and the animal floral. Of human life. She stopped to listen to a woman scolding a boy for leaving the latch unhooked and smiled because the scolding sounded like love wearing a heavier dress. She bought a sewn doll from a man with one hand good and the other stiff and gave it to a child who would have looked at a real doll and been afraid to touch it. She sat on a stool outside a house with a sunken door and drank beer so bad it made her grin. She let herself be seen. A queen is a story that is told by the eyes of the people looking at her. She wished to tell them a story that could be made into bread. A creak came from an alley and the 2 guards shifted without making themselves bigger. Sansa did not turn her head. Arya stepped out of the shadow like a cat, realizing it had a human in the room with it and measuring whether the human would be any use. She took the empty cup, drank the last sour drops, and wiped her mouth with the back of her hand. "He's pricking at the edges," Arya said under the noise of someone beating a rug at the next door down. "Little pricks. He wants to see where we bruise." "He'll find that we bruise in the right places," Sansa said, "and then he'll be angry that we do not bleed where he expected." "He's arranged for a letter to be found," Arya said. "It says that the Vale is uneasy and Winterfell is unsafe and a ship is better than a wall. It suggests he might take me somewhere with him for my own good. He left it where I would find it, but not before Ser Lyn would find it first." Sansa did not change her face. The badly brewed beer wanted to change it for her. She did not allow it. "And did Ser Lyn find it?" "He found it, and he found me angry about it, and he found me tearing it into pieces and feeding it to the pigs," Arya said. "He went white and then pink and then thought about telling you and then thought about not telling you and then found Davos and told him, and now we are here." "You tear things up so neatly," Sansa said. and her voice had such affection in it that Arya looked down, because sometimes the truth is like a knife set into the palm by someone who loves you. It hurts and you keep it. Tell Davos I'll see him at noon. Tell Lord Royce to be where he can hear his men complaining and agree with them. Tell Wolkin to find 2 scullions who can write better than he thinks they can and give them clean pens. I want the South to know we have ink." Arya nodded and then stood for a moment and let her shoulder touch Sansa's for the length of a breath. "You smell like bad beer," she said, and strode away grinning. "Intolerable child," Sansa said fondly to the empty air, and swung her cloak and continued to walk. The noon council was a quiet fire that warmed and did not burn. Davos told her he'd heard the same word. Safety on ships, the Vale uneasy, from 2 mouths that did not know each other's teeth. Lord Royce admitted gruffly that a pair of Ser this and Ser that had begun to question why their men were hauling stone instead of polishing swords for their queen's honor. Sansa said the swords could be polished while men waited for the stones to be lifted. She said a grain tower was an act of war at the right angle, and a man who did not see that was a man she wished to keep far from ladders. She said to let the Vale complain and to answer the complaint with work. She said to keep Peter busy offering solutions to problems that did not exist, and to thank him for each with such charm that he would grow suspicious of his own usefulness and try to prove it. "Salt and smiles," Davos said. "You have a merchant's soul, your grace." "I have a memory for prices," Sansa said. "What do we owe the South if they come with swords? What do we owe the North if we open our gates to them?" "We owe the North a chance to keep breathing," Royce said, and he made the word North sound like a wife he had come to love after a long time. She nodded. "Then we will buy that chance with everything but our names." When the council was over, she went to the armory where the blacksmiths had begun to set aside a box each week with the best of the glass-bound points. She took one up and balanced it in her palm. It was ugly and right. She thought of the crown on her head and the way it had left its mark on her brow that first night. She thought of how the mark had faded and then returned and then faded again. She thought of John's letters written in wood and stone and of how he had learned to write where he could not be seen writing. She put the point down carefully, as if it might be offended. That night it snowed with such purpose that men stopped trying to find new words for the cold and settled into old ones. John lay on his back and watched the flakes fall past the scar of light from the opening of the ruin they were sheltering in. Ghost slept with his back against the man's side and his breath went in and out like sea. Tormund told a story about a woman he had loved who had beaten him twice and had a laugh like an axe hitting fat wood. Mouse snored, a noise like a tiny saw. Leaf sat with her chin on her knees and looked out and said nothing, because sometimes nothing is the most respectful thing to offer a dark that does not ask to be named. John dreamed of the crypts. This was a habit he had not asked for and had learned to accept like a scar. He could not name the day he had earned it. In the dream, the statues were alive just enough to breathe but not enough to open their eyes. He heard water somewhere it should not have been. He heard a woman's voice say a word that had no letters and meant only this: wait. He woke with his hand clenched and a pain in his palm where a nail had pushed into it. He opened his fist and looked at the half-moon of blood. He wiped it on the blanket. He did not try to sleep again. At dawn, the blue came back, beating on the edge of the world. It moved more quickly than it had moved before and then stopped, as if it were learning its own caution. John stood and did not pull his cloak tight, because a man standing small teaches the cold a lesson he does not mean to teach it. He stood broad and without hurry and let the blue measure him until it had learned enough and went. He thought then of Howland Reed's hand on the birch and the way the cut had felt, and he felt a great weariness and a great patience. They were married in him like two people who had chosen one another despite knowing what it would cost. He came back to Winterfell again when his clothes had forgotten what washing meant and his beard had started to keep secrets. The gates recognized him and pretended to complain. He found Sansa in the Godswood, where the cold was the same as it had been every time he had come to that place, and where the tree did not change its mind about how to watch. She had no crown on her head. She looked younger in that white, which is to say she looked more like herself beneath the iron. He told her about the boys and the ring that held and the hesitation that saved and the learning that scared him. She told him about the envoy and the letter and the barrel house and the trick with the ledgers and the way she had learned to ask Lord Serwyn to complain in front of the men who needed to hear themselves think. They stood like that for some time, speaking simply. He realized, with the sting of an honest joy, that there were fewer words between them now than there had been when walls had been kinder and life had been foolish. "Will the South come?" he asked at last. "Yes," she said. "But they will come as if they are walking on a road they cannot see. They will step carefully. They will speak with mouths that do not wish to be cold. We will show them our rings and our bread, and they will despise us for both and ask for both anyway. We will not go to them," he said. "No," she said. "The last time we went to them, they taught us what it costs to be guests in a house that smiles while it counts." He thought of Ned and of banners and of a boy standing in a hall too full of pictures that others had painted for him. He thought of the shame that belongs to those who survive and then learn they must survive well to make survival mean anything. He reached out and touched the bark where the face had been carved, and his fingers came away with the damp of snowmelt. The old gods were not gods, he had come to think. They were the memory of a forest that had once been one thing rather than many. He did not ask them for anything because he did not know what to ask for that he wasn't already trying to make. Arya came through the arch lightly as a woman who knows how to walk in a room where someone might be lying on the floor. She held a small coin between her first two fingers, a coin with a hole in the middle and a design of waves. She tossed it to Jon, and he caught it with his left hand. "What is this?" he asked. "A piece of a story Peter tells himself at night," she said. "He kept it hidden under a loose stone. He thinks it will come in useful when he needs to become small enough to fit on a ship. He thinks it's a friend. It's just a coin." "You took it," Sansa said, satisfied in the way a woman is when a plan makes a tidy circle. "I took it and left another," Arya said. "Mine says different things when you hold it to the light." She smiled, and for a moment she was a girl who had stolen a tart and learned the tart was for a feast whose master didn't deserve it. He will look at it when he is alone, and it will talk to him in a voice that sounds like his own, and he will think he is clever twice. He will try something because of that. I will be there when he does. "Don't let him fall," Sansa said. "Not yet. We may need his hands to move furniture. But let him know there is a window behind him when he backs up." Arya nodded, and the coin turned in her fingers one last time and was gone. On the wall that night, the wind came up like a man who has decided at last to say his piece. The guards drew their cloaks tighter and pretended not to look at Jon, and Jon pretended not to see their pretending. He went to the highest tower and stood with the cold touching him in 100 small honest ways. Far out on the plain the fires lay like the plans of poor men. Not straight, not symmetrical, but right where they were needed. He felt the blue touch him lightly and move on. He felt the old cold far away, like a memory worse than the thing remembered. He felt Sansa in the hall below, going over lists with Wolken and with that severe, kind woman from the town who had learned to strike off names. He felt Arya moving through the corridors like a soft knife teaching itself patience. He felt ghosts settle on a parapet and stare into a dark that did not care. He left his print in the snow at the corner of the wall where he knew Sansa would walk in the morning. Not a secret so much as a promise. He scratched the three-armed knot into a stone where a child would someday set his hand and feel it and not know what it had meant and be safe anyway. He did not pray. He waited. The South did not come that week. The Blue did not test a different ring that week. The world held its breath as if it were trying not to wake a sleeping giant. In the space that made, Sansa called the heads of 10 small houses to Winterfell. Not the proud ones who write their names with flourishes, but the ones whose banners are the color of old blankets. They came with the awkwardness of people and used to being asked their opinions. She fed them soup that had more meat in it than usual and asked them about harvest, roofs, roads, and suns. She listened. She asked them whether their people were more afraid of hunger or of the cold that thinks. When they answered, she wrote something down and then told Wolken to find a way to send each of them home with a story to tell that made them look important. They left with spines straighter. When you make a man feel listened to, you teach him to listen to himself. Jon watched all this because sometimes shadow is a balcony and not a cave. He spoke to a boy who had burned his hand making a ring fire, and to a girl whose mother had taught her to lace boots tighter when the cold made leather shrink. He walked the yard and let horses put their warm noses against his glove. He watched Arya teach 3 boys to fall properly, so they would not be afraid of falling later when the falling would be less forgiving. He watched Sansa laugh at something Davos had said. He allowed himself a luxury most men spend badly and too often, the luxury of being content for the length of time it takes a man to drink a cup and wash it and set it to dry. Before dawn on the day he meant to leave again, he went to the crypts. He took a candle because candles are large enough for the kind of darkness that is only dark and not something else. The air down there was its own weather. He walked past the stone eyes and the stone swords and the stone wolves and the stone women whose faces were tender and relentless. He stopped where he usually stopped because there are stopping places in a man's life that do not ask why. He stood and said nothing aloud. He did not need to. He set the candle down and its small light made friends with the damp. When he turned to go, he saw a smear on the stone near the stair where the damp had dripped in a pattern he did not remember seeing before. 3 lines crossing and crossing again, the knot he had learned. He reached and touched it. It was only water. He smiled because even water did not mind learning someone else's trick. On his way out, he passed Arya sitting on a step with her chin on her knees and the coin moving in her fingers like a story. She did not look up. "Don't die," she said. "I won't," he said. "Don't get used to not dying," she said then. And he laughed and the sound surprised him the way a small kindness from a stranger surprises you after a long winter. He left by the hunter's gate. A woman sweeping snow from her stoop straightened and looked at him and then put her head down and pretended she had not looked. He nodded to a boy who held a bundle of arrows bound with new twine, and the boy blushed and tried not to look happy. Ghost trotted ahead and then came back, the way a wolf will if you've taught each other to do it. In the yard, Peter watched him go from a window that he thought hid him. Peter smiled in a way that men smile at a game they think they are still winning, and then raised his hand to his collar and rubbed at a place where the cloth irritated him. When he drew his hand back he frowned faintly, because there was a small smear of dark on his finger and he could not think how it had gotten there. He wiped it on his cloak. He went to find Lord Royce to say something helpful. The forest took John in with its usual unceremonious welcome. The cold was ordinary that morning, which is to say it was honest. The blue did not present itself. The sky had a color to it like metal. He thought of Howland Reed and the hum that came when a night forgot it was only night. He thought of Sansa's wings and the shape her mouth made when she was pleased with someone and did not show it. He thought of Arya's coin and the fact that men condemn themselves when they are allowed to. He thought of shovels standing ready in their lean-to, and of boys who would remember where they were without being told. The work waited where he had left it. He went to it. He laid a ring with a Cranagman's patience and a free folkman's cheer. He carved the knot with a bastard steadiness and a king's refusal to name fear by its favorite name. He left marks as he went, because his queen had asked him to. He listened for blue and for old cold and for the ordinary, saving noises of a world that still belonged to the living. That night, while men slept in Winterfell and the fire snapped in the hall and made old beams glow like the insides of apples, Sansa dreamed of the great hearth being cold and of walking its length with a stick that scratched a line into the ash as she went. In the morning the hearth was warm where it should be. She rose and dressed and put on the crown and took it off and put it on again and went out to weigh and to count and to be looked at by people who were learning to look at her with affection that had nothing to do with fear. She found the print on the wall and smiled and did not touch it, because touching certain proofs can be a kind of ruin. The South would come with banners and expectations and hunger. The old cold would come with no banners at all. With it, perhaps, the blue that thinks would have learned enough to be dangerous in new ways. Between those inevitabilities lived 1,000 small choices men could make and women could insist upon. That space, narrow and precise as a seam well sewn, was where the North would stand. They would lay fires where rooms forgot their corners. They would stack wood and stories until both could be lit at the right moment. They would polish shovels and teach boys to fall and teach girls to count and bring the old gods their practical piety. They would write in stone and bark and ordinary kindness. Jon's shadow would move through the snow like a letter written to the right reader. Sansa's iron would sit on her head like a promise kept. Arya's coin would talk to a man who thought he had not met his match. The people who make thrones matter would learn that rings of flame can be as steady as crowns, and that a wolf who ranges is more faithful than a dog who sits. Beyond the rings, in the high country, the blue came again, far off and near, as if it were putting its ear to the belly of the world and waiting to hear whether it still held a child. It paused by a birch with a neat cut in it and considered the gift that had been left long ago and had been eaten by someone else. It moved on, not happy, not unhappy, because such things are not given that comfort. In the city where the South keeps its gold, a woman looked north and smiled into a mirror, as if she loved a face she would one day betray. On the sea, a dragon tasted salt and was reminded of blood. And in Winterfell, where the stones did not pretend to be anything but stone, a queen walked her walls in the hour before dawn and put her hand to the place where a wolf had passed and said, very softly, the simplest prayer in the language of the living, "Let us be enough."